Everyone, are the slides showing up as they should be? Okay, excellent. So I'm Rabbi Ruti Regan. This is our Matan webinar series on various aspects of disability inclusion in Jewish life. And today we're going to talk about kosher inclusion because we're heading into summer camp season, and all year round it's kind of school season, conference season, kosher program season. And we've found that Kashrut policies and the need to keep camps and schools and other programs kosher can be a real sticking point for inclusivity. And so in this webinar, we're going to talk about how we might reframe it and some approaches we might take to problem solving. And as usual, if you want to follow along in the slides, they're available. There's a link in the chat box, and it's also bit.ly/kosher inclusion. And we also have live captions, bit.ly Matan captions. And as the webinar goes, I will be watching the chat box. So if you want to put a question in, you can put a question in the chat box and I'll find a time to address it in the webinar. So without further ado, so kosher inclusion. First rule of inclusive kashrut is that everyone's allowed to eat. Eating's kind of inherently necessary. And in an inclusive kashrut policy, Jews with disabilities are allowed to eat safely in Jewish spaces. Jews with disabilities are included in meals, treats, communal activities involving food. Everyone's treated with respect. No one feels left out. No one feels separated from the community or like they're failing. And part of how we frame being kosher inclusively and don't leave people out, so we have to really keep in mind that kosher is not the same for everyone. If we want to know, is something kosher, we have to ask who's eating it and why. So what keeping kosher means at the core is that you're eating the food that is permitted to you by Jewish law to eat. Now, what is permissible to eat? It depends. If someone needs to eat something for health reasons, Jewish law not only permits, but requires them to eat it. If someone is eating what they're supposed to eat, they're keeping kosher. And in order to answer, is that kosher? First thing we have to ask is who's eating it. And I think that we kind of get this in a lot of areas of Jewish life, that kosher depends on context. For instance, if we ask, is rice kosher on Passover? The answer to that is it depends who's asking. Like, is it somebody who's in an Ashkenazi community that prohibits eating like corn, rice, other kitniot on Passover? Or are they in a community that doesn't have that rule? Or are they someone even within an Ashkenazi community who needs to eat that? So we kind of get this. Some things are kosher for some people, but not others. I think that it makes the most sense to frame inclusive kashrut as people are keeping kosher if they are following the rules that apply to them. In order to answer, is that kosher? First thing we need to ask is who's eating it and why. So first rule of inclusive kashrut is everybody eats. Second rule of inclusive kashrut is everybody keeps kosher here, right? This is a kosher program. Every Jew is welcome. Every Jew keeps kosher here. And that looks different for different people because that's how kosher works. I think it's really important not to define what we're doing as exempting some people from the kashrut policy, so much as having access to the kashrut policy, because, the rule is that everyone here keeps kosher in the way that makes sense for their body. And we don't say things like, she doesn't have to keep kosher. Rather, say things like, that's kosher for her, because it is, because she's supposed to eat it and it's permitted to her. And the reason I think this is important is because kosher, having a relationship to kosherness is pretty central to Jewish identity, whatever choices people make about it. Some people choose to keep kosher, some people choose not to. People choose to interpret kosher in a wide variety of ways. And those ways have implications for how someone sees themselves in relation to the community and in relation to various Jewish commitments in the Torah and all of that. And so I think we should be very careful not to define anyone out of it. If somebody's body needs certain things, we shouldn't define them as the Jew who's not keeping kosher. We shouldn't say they don't have to, because in that case, we're still saying they aren't, and it still has identity implications. So I think it's much better to frame it in terms of not they're exempt from keeping kosher, but that's kosher for them. So how? Inclusive kashrut practices are often a matter of putting up the right fences. So in summer camp, and particularly in spaces where people may come with a variety of practices, but need camp or school or wherever to have its own standard, and to feed a lot of people who don't know each other and aren't really accustomed to dealing with food together, the usual strategy for dealing with that is to have kashrut policies that are very restrictive, because that keeps things simpler and they're much more, tractable and straightforward to follow and enforce. For instance, no outside food is one simple kashrut policy that a lot of places have. And it's not that food coming from outside isn't kosher, it's that dealing with outside food is an extra step in complication. Or saying another really restrictive rule for the sake of simplicity is to say that, we have meat meals and we have dairy rules. We have meat meals and dairy meals. Everyone eats the meat stuff at meat meals. Everyone eats the dairy stuff at dairy meals. And that's a policy that's used because it makes keeping stuff kosher much more straightforward. It eliminates conflict over what people are and are not allowed to combine. But there's really, on a technical halachic kosher level, if one person is eating meat and another person is eating dairy and they're sitting near each other, they're both keeping kosher and they're not trafing up anything or undermining the kashrut. The policy is we put up certain fences to keep things kosher, but the logistical fences are not the kashrut. The kashrut is more complex and flexible than people often realize. And the policies that keep things simple and straightforward often don't work in the same way when we want to be inclusive, because not everyone can do things the same way. And just coming with the expectation that an inclusive kashrut policy is going to be more labor intensive, and it's going to require more kashrut expertise. And it starts with presuming that the problems we have are solvable. If the kashrut policy is causing problems for people with disabilities, it's not because keeping kosher is impossible. It's because the policy is miscalibrated. If we assume there's a solution and work with the person who needs the food and the rabbi or the mashgiach who has this level of expertise, kashrut is often much more flexible than people realize it is when their experience of it is these rigid policies implemented for logistical reasons. So just being aware of the fence is not the Torah, the fence is not the kashrut, and changing the fence doesn't make things any less kosher. It just means that we're changing the implementation of how to be kosher and how to keep it kosher. So, if you get nothing else from this webinar, this slide right here is often the core of making kashrut work without excluding people, is that you've got to give your rabbi or your mashgiach the context when you're asking whether something's allowed or not. When you ask rabbis kosher questions, they need to know why you are asking. And the reason for that is that, they have a certain context they're assuming, right? Like if you just ask, is this allowed? The question that they will probably answer is, are most people allowed to do that here? Have we allowed this in the past? Do you think that it would be a good idea if people started doing that? And if that's the question you're asking, the answer is often going to be no, because saying yes would interfere with the fence, which would cause problems. But there are good reasons to interfere with the fence that don't cause kashrut problems. For instance, so if you're asking because the policy is causing a problem, you need to tell them that there's a problem, what the problem is, and what you would like to do about it, and why you think that would solve the problem. For instance, if you ask, is it okay to eat meat today? And it's during the 9 days when most people will say that eating meat isn't permitted, or if it's, at a dairy meal or something. If you say, is it okay to give my campers meat today? The answer to that question is going to be no. If the question you ask is, so I have a camper who is allergic to all of the other protein sources, can I let them have some meat, and how do we do that? The answer might be yes. The answer to that question might be, okay, you can, and here's how we make a plan to make sure that it doesn't get mixed with other campers' food. Like maybe we'll give them a different color placemat, or we'll, buffer with, have them sit next to the vegans, between the people who are eating dairy, or the answers might still be no, but it's a different kind of no. The answer might be, I don't think that's a good idea, but can you tell me more about what their food needs are? Like, what are they allergic to? Do you know what's available in camp? Have we talked to them and their parents about what else they might be able to eat? Because it might be that the solution is, again, because a lot of camps have a very short list of kosher certification symbols, hashgachas, hechshers that they'll accept. But often there are exceptions when there need to be. For instance, you may consider a particular kosher supervision not reliable enough to use for everything, or to have some problems. But if the thing that you want to bring in is a vegan parve thing for someone with significant allergies, the answer to, can I rely on this for that purpose, may be yes. So these problems tend to be solvable when people are being reasonable, but you have to tell your halachic authority, your rabbi or your mashgiach, what the problem actually is, or they won't, or they'll answer the wrong question and you'll run into trouble. So again, key thing, if nothing else, take that to heart. Give the person you're asking Jewish law questions the context of the situation you're asking about. It helps. Okay. So I'm going to shift gears a little here. So I mentioned food disability, Jews with food disabilities. Well, what's a food disability? One of the most well-known food disabilities, of course, is being allergic to something. And we'll talk about that specific example in a minute, but food disability is a very broad category. It's not just allergies. There are a huge range of medical conditions that can affect what someone can eat, needs to eat, how much they need to eat, or what. So for instance, food disabilities mean that someone has different food needs than most other people in ways that might require accommodations. For instance, needing to avoid allergens is one pretty common thing. being unable to eat most things and having a pretty restricted list of foods that you can eat can happen for a lot of different reasons. Needing to eat specific foods at specific times of day or alternate foods on different days. Like, people can have very complex food scheduling needs sometimes. Using medication alongside food. Yeah, and these are just a few examples of different food disabilities that people can have. And I'm going to go into a few more examples in a bit more detail, but before I do that, a couple of cautions here. Caution number one, there are life and death issues involved here. Unsafe food can cause very serious injury or death. Lack of access to edible food can cause serious injury or death. Unsafe food and food deprivation can also cause illness, excruciating pain, and long-term health complications. So, a couple of things about that. Two things, like, okay. Secondary, related caution about that. I'm not a doctor. This is not medical advice. I'm not an allergy specialist. This is not allergy specialties training. Safety questions should be addressed to someone with appropriate safety expertise, which is often the person who has the food need and or their parents if you're in a program for children. So, like, make sure that you're getting your safety information in specific cases from people who know what they're about safety. And yeah, general caution about that. That said, another caution is that we have to be careful that this does not become a reason to separate people from the community, because, people who have medical conditions have them all the time and take risks all the time. And Jews with medical conditions need access to Jewish communities. So, like, do take this seriously. Don't let it scare you out of including people. So with that in mind, let's talk about a few examples of food-related disabilities. One, again, this is one of the more well-known ones, is allergies. So exposure to allergens makes the body have an immune response that ends up attacking the body. And it's not about something being toxic, it's about it triggering an immune reaction. So with allergies, even really tiny amounts of something can trigger a reaction for some people. The other thing to be mindful of regarding allergies is that, nuts, dairy, and latex are some of the more common ones, but people can be allergic to nearly anything. Nearly any proteins, nearly anything. So, like, don't assume that you can, by eliminating one substance, you can make things safe for everyone. You have to have a policy about allergens that assumes that for some people in your program, there will be allergens present at the site, and that you need to be able to feed them in a way that's safe for them, even though some people will be consuming things in the program that that person's allergic to. Some programs ban peanuts or sesame or nuts, and there are arguments in favor or opposed to that, but it is not possible to ban every substance from your program to which some people are allergic. And so you need to have a plan in place for thinking of allergies in that sense as well, and not just the common ones. Because if you get a reputation for being an inclusive program, you will end up attracting a lot of people with uncommon food issues, and will need a plan that allows for a pretty broad range of difference. It's just, how it works. So intolerances are also a thing, and they're different from allergies. Food intolerances don't cause this like intense immune reaction. They do make people very sick in other ways. And this affects people in a range of ways. There's a lot of bad food reactions that people can have. Not going to go into a lot of them in detail, just like know that it's a thing. It's not the same as an allergy, but it's still very important to take it seriously. Another thing, and I think to really pause and think about this one, is that sensory aversions are a disability. Some people find most textures and tastes like unbearably repulsive and inedible. And I think that this is often one of the most stigmatized disabilities in spaces, in like our communal spaces, because people's sensory aversions are often presumed to be bad behavior or just like being an entitled brat or something. But having extreme aversions to most food is not bad behavior, and it's a disability. It's something that needs to be accommodated and not stigmatized. You cannot fix somebody's sensory disability by being mean to them or refusing to feed them. And there's a lot of reasons that people can have sensory aversions. I think one of the more well-known reasons is that, a lot of autistic people have extreme food aversions. But there are other reasons as well. Like people who have a lot of food intolerances often develop extreme sensory aversions to food because they have so much experience with, they eat something and they get sick and then develop an aversion to it. That's like a physiological response that people have. If you eat something and then get really sick afterwards, you will often end up finding that food nauseatingly inedible afterwards. And I think, a lot of people, like if you've ever had food poisoning, that might be the last time you ever ate that. And for a lot of people, they've had that with just such a broad range of foods because it happens to them repeatedly. Another way that extreme sensory aversions leading to a limited diet can happen is that if somebody is generally food intolerant, like they have really bad reflux early in life, and they get to the point where they can't really keep anything down, and they have to use a feeding tube for nutrition. One thing that happens sometimes even after the initial eating problem has resolved, people still find that they can't tolerate eating by mouth because they associate it with such intense pain. And so when people have had those experiences, getting to the point where anything at all is edible can take a lot of time. And being mean to people about food will not solve their food problems. It will just cause new negative associations with food. So like sensory aversions to food are a disability, not something that's shameful or bad behavior. So which leads to another thing, which is that food disability is really diverse. And if you get a reputation for being an inclusive program, you will see the diversity of food disability really clearly, because people with food disabilities who will come to your program because that will attract them, which is a great marketing thing because it will attract them, it will attract their whole families, and it'll be really great. But it also means that you can't just plan for one thing because you're likely to see a huge range of it because people with different rare conditions talk to each other and will love this. This is a great program where I'll actually be welcome. So just keep in mind, these things in webinars that are examples, not an exhaustive list. Food disability can affect people in a very broad range of ways. You will almost certainly encounter disabilities and needs you haven't heard of before. Don't expect to be familiar with everything. And realize that you may encounter some things that your first visceral reaction to is like, really, is that even a thing? Yeah, probably is. Yeah, there's a lot of things. Another part of this is people can have more than one food disability. For instance, someone who has diabetes could also have a peanut allergy. And again, I talked about this before. People who have severe food intolerances often have developed sensory severe sensory aversions. Most people with cystic fibrosis eventually become diabetic too. So there's people can and often do have more than one food disability. So remember to keep in mind that things can coincide and that you're likely to need more than one strategy, even for the same disability, because often people will have another one. And that this is going to require creative, ongoing problem solving and effort rather than a set and forget one-time strategy. Another thing about the complexity here is that there is no universal healthy food. Healthy depends on what someone's needs are. And we need to be careful about not shaming people for their bodies and their needs. For instance, some people can't safely eat vegetables. For some people, vegetables are unhealthy and inedible. Some people need a very high-fat, high-protein diet to control seizures. So for them, super high-fat food is often healthy food, necessary food. Some people need a very high-calorie diet because of the inefficient way their body processes food. And all of this is healthy food for what their bodies need. And I think that the way we talk about food and health can end up being really stigmatizing to people who have different needs, because people with disabilities are often perceived as causing their own problems by being unhealthy or doing the wrong things. So if we say if you don't eat healthy, it will cause problems, eating healthy looks like eating carrots, and people see one of their peers eating ice cream and they know that that person is, has a medical condition, it's very easy for them to wrongly reach the conclusion that person is sick because they eat ice cream. So just be careful about how you talk about healthy eating choices and healthy eating. Talk about it in an inclusive way that doesn't single anyone out as unhealthy for doing the things that is necessary for them. And this is an implicit bias kind of thing. I would hope that none of us are saying things like, that person's eating ice cream, they're so unhealthy, although, maybe we are. But if we're saying carrots are healthy, eat carrots, it excludes that person and we need to include them. Another thing goes in line with both the don't be mean thing, but also camp is not therapy. Inclusive kashrut, keeping the kosher inclusive, is about accessibility. It's about making sure that people can participate in the program, be part of the community, and eat safely. That is the goal of inclusive kosher policies. Don't take it upon yourself to try to fix someone's food issues. It's not likely to work. It is likely to cause serious problems. There's a reason why feeding therapy is a profession for which people go to school and there's certifications. And there's a reason why there's all of these medical specialties. And people know themselves better than you know them. So don't try to be someone's therapist. Don't try to fix someone's food issues. Even if you're right, it's not a bad idea, and it's not, even if you're right about what the problem is, it's not a good idea to put yourself in that kind of role. It's not appropriate. It's not ethical. Don't be a therapist. Be a teacher, be a counselor, be a director. Keep your things, make your program accessible, and give people access to food they can eat safely. That's the goal. Part of this is that it's important to listen to people, and it's important to listen to parents. People with food disabilities know what they need. Parents of kids with food disabilities know what their kids need. They've done this before. They've been dealing with this for years. They know who all of their medical professionals are. And they're going to know things you don't know about how to make it work. Just not to say that you have to accept their first suggestion always, but take them seriously and don't ignore their perspective, don't be dismissive, and don't do something they think is unsafe. This works much better if there's proactive listening and collaboration as early as possible in the process. So, talked about some food disabilities. Now we're going to talk about some common access needs related to food disabilities. Again, not an exhaustive list, but there are some things that you will probably encounter. One really common access need is needing to know all of the ingredients that are in something. Because people might have a really broad range of things that they can't eat or need to eat in controlled amounts. So some people really need to know all the ingredients and not rely on other people to remember whether or not it has stuff in it that's a problem with them. And a good way to do this is to save packages so people can read the ingredients, and to write down a list of the ingredients that go into something. So you're not relying just on your memory, because memory is unreliable, especially when it's not an issue that you know the ins and outs of. And don't take ingredients questions personally, because when people are asking, it's because they have a good reason to think that it's important for them to ask and to check themselves. It's not a personal comment on you. It's somebody's safety strategy that they use across the board because they found that it's what works best for their health and safety. So another thing that's a pretty common access need is some people can only eat a very limited range of foods. Again, there's multiple reasons for this. Sometimes it's because they're on an elimination diet to try to figure out what they're allergic to, or they have extreme sensory aversions, or they have multiple allergies to really common ingredients. But for some people, there's a very limited range of foods that they can reliably eat, which means that a common access need is to make sure that the foods that they can eat are available, and make sure that they are available in a way that is not punitive or stigmatizing. And this is often, this can be logistically challenging to accommodate, but sometimes the only thing that's needed to accommodate this is for people to get over their egos. One thing I saw in camp is that there were a few kids who, were reliably able to eat milk and cereal. We had a ton of milk and cereal. And it was really no problem at all to provide it. But some of the counselors felt like they needed to make this a power struggle, and that they really needed to make their campers eat the pizza and the mac and cheese instead of the milk and cereal. And just encourage you, don't have power struggles like that. If food is readily available and it's how you can reliably feed someone, just feed them and don't take it personally. It really helps a lot. Yeah, and make sure that if you're in a supervisory role, make sure that your counselors and people who are working directly with kids know that, and pay attention to how they're acting with kids with limited diets, especially kids with limited diets for sensory aversion reasons, and that they're feeding them and not shaming them. It makes a really big difference in both safety, nutrition, and social inclusivity. So another really common thing is the need to avoid cross-contamination. Especially for people with allergies, even a tiny amount of a substance getting into something can make it deadly dangerous to them. And I can't give you a whole lecture on avoiding cross-contamination. This is like a learn this from a safety professional and listen to the person with the need thing. Be aware that it exists. And one of the major implications here is that buffet lines will not work for everyone. Some people will need their food to be kept separate from that so that there isn't a risk of it being contaminated by food that's dangerous to them. And it also means that the people who are preparing the food need to have a working knowledge of how to avoid cross-contamination, and you need to make sure that they're taking it seriously. So again, I can't give you a lot of details about this issue, but you need to know that it exists and you need to have a plan for dealing with it. Another really common thing, and I think that this is often one of the biggest sticking points in kosher programs, is that push come to shove, some people need to bring their own food. Like camp provided food, we can do a lot to make camp or school or program provided food work for people. And I've seen it done really well. Raman Nayak in particular does it really well. But push come to shove, the range of complex food disabilities that exists means that some people are going to need to bring their own food, and that we need to have plans in place for dealing with that within the Kashrut policy without just excluding them. So sometimes people bringing their own food is as simple as bringing ingredients for the kitchen to use. That's often not super problematic from a kashrut standpoint. Like usually you can just have like the mashgiach or rabbi check to see whether those ingredients are a problem. It's usually pretty possible to find ones that aren't. And so that's one possibility. Another one is bringing in prepackaged certified kosher food or ingredients. Like for a lot of people who might need, say, specialized yogurt or something, that can be an option. Some people will, in some circumstances, need to bring in food that they made themselves at home. And which means that we need a plan for setting this up without the food being a kashrut problem for what others are eating. The good news is it's pretty hard to trafe up other people's food. Two people eating together at a table does not cause food to become contaminated. People eating food at a table does not cause the kitchen to become contaminated. One thing that you can do is do something like, have disposable dishes for outside food if you're not regularly using them. You can have a different placemat. You can have, sometimes you can use objects as a reminder on the table. And this is also a reason that I think it's really best to frame this as not she's exempt from the kashrut policy, but that's kosher for her. Because then the way you can describe it to the group is, that's kosher for her. It's not kosher for you, so you can't eat it, but it is kosher for her, so she's not doing anything wrong. And just like we use different colors of tablecloths to say this is a meat meal or this is a dairy meal, we're using a different placemat to say this is kosher for her, and this is the placemat where it's eaten. And there are various strategies you can use. That's one of them. But there really needs to be a plan in place for including people who need to bring their own food. And it's really problematic for the solution to be preventing them from eating with others. It's better than excluding them from the program, but like making one kid eat outside where all of their kids are like bonding together at the table is painful. And if it's the best you can do, it's better than not letting them come, and it's better than not letting them eat. but I would really encourage you to find a better solution to that problem. And this is also for adults too. When people are not allowed to eat food at the meals, things happen at meals other than nutrition. Like people who can't eat together with their colleagues at a conference miss out on a lot of networking and conversation. So I think that it's really important to find an approach to this that works for people, that works and allows us to include a broad range of people. Another pretty common access need is needing to know what food will be available when. For instance, some people need to know when to take insulin or enzymes. And so like dosing their medication appropriately depends on them really knowing what the food is going to be and when the food is going to be. And that includes things like treats and surprises. So, yeah, be mindful of that. Some people have food anxiety and really need things to be predictable, so that they don't get like out of control and anxious about food. That can be really important for people with eating disorders sometimes. Sometimes people need to know what the food will be so they can predict problems before they arise, particularly with people with particularly complex needs who have experienced that people tend to make mistakes. If they see maybe like, okay, there's pizza on the menu, I bet this problem might happen. It's a lot easier to solve those problems when it's not like 5 minutes into the start of the meal. Another access need is some people need to have constant access to food, or like near constant access to food. For instance, some people need food available to regulate blood sugar. Some people need to eat really frequently in order to get enough calories. Some people need food available to manage food anxiety or other problems. So just the ways of making food available, vary depending on context. So I'm not going to say specifically how to handle that. Just like be aware that this is a real access need for some people and think about what your options might be. So Kashrut, having given you the safety cautions earlier, I'm going to give a Jewish peoplehood caution. Kashrut policies risk cutting Jews with food disabilities off from the community. Some Jews are not allowed to eat safely in their Jewish community spaces. And that's really not an okay thing, because meals loom large in our gatherings. And it's literally important to have a place at the table. And it's important to be someone who can be seen as observant and within Kashrut and Jewishness. So it's not just about nutrition. It's also about being welcome at meals, being part of the conversations that happen at meals, sharing in treats, activities, and celebrations, participating in Jewish ritual, and being part of the community. And I think the key thing really about Jewish inclusive efforts of any kind is that building a world in which we understand that having a disability does not cut you off from Jewishness, Judaism, or the Jewish community. Your body cannot make you a bad Jew. Your body cannot make you a failed Jew. Your body cannot make you a sinner. Yeah. And seeing Jews tell me, like a lot of people have told me the equivalent of, because of my disability, I can't keep kosher. And it's not because they think keeping kosher is stupid or pointless. It's because they think that their disability takes them outside of that. Which is why I think that we need to define kashrut in a way that has room for all bodies. Because if somebody is eating what they're supposed to be eating Jewishly, that's keeping kosher, and it's being with within the community and the covenant, and we shouldn't define people out. It's not just about nutrition, it's also about community, ritual, and Torah. So let's think about ritual staples. What can people with various needs drink for Kiddush? The most obvious ones is like, look, not everyone can have alcohol. Have things that are not alcohol. You know, for some people, sulfites are an issue, so look at that. Just think about, like, what are people's needs? What can they drink for Kiddush? What can they eat for Hamotzi? Like, is there a way to have gluten-free matzah or something else they can eat so that they can participate in blessing the meal and thanking God for our food and being part of our Hebrew prayer community? There's the Jewish ritual. There's also other kinds of ritual that tends to be important in our community. So I'd also encourage you to ask, what can people eat for birthday cakes? Because any kind of program you're in, birthday cakes will probably come up at some point. So what can people eat for birthday cakes if they can't eat your standard birthday cake? How are they going to be part of the birthday ritual and get to celebrate in a pleasurable way alongside others? Another thing, and it's about community too, is that making the food similar can sometimes be important because children often dislike being singled out or visibly different from peers. Having similar food can make some kids much more comfortable feeling like part of the group. For instance, on pizza day, having gluten-free pizza for kids who can't eat the regular kind, or dairy-free for kids who can't eat the regular kind. And similarity isn't usually as important to adults, although it does matter to some adults, but it's often super important to children. And so it's something to be mindful of. Like, can you make food fall into a similar category for people? Can you make that work for them? Because for a lot of people, it matters and it affects their perception of whether they're part of the group or not. Similarly, it's important to include people in treats and activities. When there will be a dessert at the meal, make a dessert options for people with food disabilities too. And like ideally good ones, because, you know, most kids probably don't want to eat a fruit cocktail cup while all of their friends are eating like awesome cupcakes. So think about like, what does a good dessert look like, and how do kids and staff, and this is adults too, how do adults and kids get included in sharing in treats and pleasurable shared group experiences involving food? And this is something that is usually pretty straightforward to accomplish, but tends to require planning. So likewise, snacks, activities, and celebrations. If there will be an ice cream party, what will people who can't have dairy get to eat? If you're pieing people in the face, how are you going to include people who have an anaphylactic reaction to dairy? You know, or any number of other things. When there's food activities, don't leave people behind. And so here is a specifically Jewish issue, which I think the more of a sense of kashrut and kosher that you have, the more this can be problematic. Intuitions that we develop about kashrut can cause safety mistakes in food, because we can be applying the wrong categories and we can be applying the wrong rules inadvertently. One that I've seen come up a lot is people who make the mistake of thinking that kosher for Passover is gluten-free. Kosher for Passover is not always gluten-free because matzah has gluten. People who eat gluten-free diets cannot eat stuff containing matzah generally. And a lot of kosher for Passover stuff contains matzah and matzah meal. And I've seen programs feed it to people who couldn't have gluten and tell them it was gluten-free. Stuff like that is not kosher for Passover, is not gluten-free. That said, there's another category. Non-gebracht kosher for Passover food generally is gluten-free, because that's the custom of avoiding getting matzah or matzah meal wet during Passover. So non-gebracht products generally substitute potato flour for matzah, and they're often even marked gluten-free. So if you're looking for something that's both gluten-free and certified kosher, and are often looking for non-Gebrox Passover products, can be a good source. And some of them are available year-round if you order from the food service version of the company. Again, always check with the people you're feeding about safety, but this can be a good source. Another intuition failure related to kashrut is that sometimes people kind of viscerally think of parv as vegetables. Yeah. So fish is parv, eggs are parv, honey is parv, meat-derived gelatin is sometimes considered parv. Like often you see this in gummy candy from Israel, for instance. So you have to consider that these substances may be present in parv food and not think parv equals vegetables. Again, this is something I've seen happen. Think about what the actual ingredients are. Don't use parv as a shorthand. Likewise, parv is not the same as vegetarian. It's not the same as vegan. So another thing is the issue of kashrut definitions versus safety definitions. The way milk and meat are defined for kashrut purposes is not necessarily the same as for safety purposes. For instance, if a really tiny amount of milk falls into lentil soup, sometimes the soup is still going to be parv, called batal b'shishim, nullified in 60 parts. But it's also probably no longer safe for someone with a severe dairy allergy to eat. The fact that it is halachically, according to Jewish law, parv, does not make it allergy safe. The fact that something has been koshered does not necessarily mean that it has been decontaminated for safety purposes. Related issue is things that taste bad or are considered inedible still count for safety purposes. For kashrut purposes, only things considered edible can make something non-kosher. Things that taste disgusting, like soap, or that are considered inedible. But things that don't matter for kashrut purposes can matter for safety purposes because your immune system doesn't care how something tastes. Your digestive system, will still attempt to digest it and might have a really bad reaction. So keep in mind that whether or not something affects the kashrut of something is not an identical issue to whether it affects the safety. Use safety rules for safety. And so, if I want to be more like technical and rabbinic about it, I talk this way. So don't treat hazardous substances like forbidden ta'am. Some things that make ta'am halachically irrelevant don't create safety. Things that are noten ta'am lifgam doesn't matter for safety purposes. Allergens are still allergens no matter how they taste. Allergens are not batal b'shishim. Whether their presence counts halachically or not is like nullifying their significance halachically does not stop them from being present and causing problems for safety purposes. Koshering a pot doesn't necessarily mean that you've made it safe. Waiting 24 hours might not make a difference for safety-related things. So make sure that you're using kashrut rules for kashrut and safety rules for safety. And if you're supervising someone who has like this extensive kashrut background, talk to them about the need to use kashrut rules for safety and to use kashrut rules for kashrut and safety rules for safety. And if you didn't understand the words on that slide, you're probably not doing those things. But if you're supervising someone who does understand the words on that slide, you need to make sure they've thought about this. Okay, so this is a process. You have to come in with the expectation of continuous problem solving. It gets easier with practice, both because you build repertoire of inclusion strategies and because you get better at the collaborative problem solving practice, but you're never gonna be an expert in every food disability, and you don't need to be. Like, You don't need to be a general disability expert in order to include people and feed them food they can eat safely. But you do need an inclusive attitude, willingness to listen, willingness to learn, and ability to implement and continuously improve creative strategies. Okay, so that's it for the slides. Would anyone like to ask some questions? Watch in the chat box here. Okay. So while people are thinking about questions they might have, I'm going to tell you a little bit about our next upcoming webinar. Our next webinar will be on Tuesday, June 12th, and we'll be talking about beyond fidget spinners, understanding sensory issues in Jewish educational settings, and we'll be talking about some of the issues that have come up as a result of the popularity of fidget spinners. There's been a lot of talk about sensory strategies, and there's also been a lot of backlash. And so we're going to be doing a webinar to just talk about, what sensory issues are, what they aren't, how to deal with them in a formal or informal educational setting, and how to understand some things you might see and deal with some problem solving. Okay, so see, we have one comment. I have found the Mashgiach at camp to be very helpful in problem solving. Excellent, I have too. The date of the sensory webinar is June 12th. All right. All right, thank you, everyone.